After the Viking raids ended, the killing did not stop. It changed shape. What followed was not chaos, but procedure, ritualized, repeated, and profitable. Captured noblewomen were not treated as prisoners of war, but as material, stripped of identity, broken in stages, and moved through a system so efficient that even medieval chroniclers hesitated to describe it. Modern stories remember Vikings as explorers, warriors, and founders of kingdoms. The sources remember churches turned into holding pens, camps built for processing human beings, and markets where silence increased value. This part of the Viking Age was not forgotten by accident. It was buried because it worked. Tonight, you will see what the records describe, what later writers tried to soften, and why this history was never meant to be told aloud. The screaming had ended 3 hours ago, and the silence that replaced it was worse. It pressed down on the ruined city like a second layer of ash, thick and suffocating, carrying the smells of smoke, blood, and wet stone. York had fallen 9 days earlier, broken open by the great heathen army in a storm of iron and fire, and now the city existed in a state between life and death. Fires still smoldered in the collapsed quarters. Bodies lay where they had fallen, already stripped of anything worth carrying. The living had been gathered, sorted, and chained, and those chains now led into places the captives were not meant to leave. Ealafu of Northumbria crouched against the inner wall of what had once been a church. She was 29 years old. Until 9 days ago, she had been the wife of a land-holding noble whose estates stretched from the river to the forest edge, a woman accustomed to command, to order, to the certainty that status created protection. That certainty had died with her husband, whose body she had seen dragged through the street on the second day after the walls fell. Her children were dead as well. She had watched them pulled from her arms during the first sorting, separated by age and usefulness, taken toward a direction from which no one returned. Everything she had built over 12 years of marriage now existed only in fragments inside her mind, and even those fragments were dissolving under the weight of what she had witnessed since. The church had been stripped of its sacred meaning within hours of the capture. The altar was smashed, the wooden cross had been torn down and burned for heat. Iron rings had been driven into the stone walls, and through those rings ran chains linking 43 women together in lines that prevented any one of them from moving without pulling all the others. Noblewomen, merchants' wives, daughters of craftsmen, anyone the raiders considered valuable enough to keep alive shared the same floor. Status still existed here, but only as a measurement of price. Ealafu could feel the iron collar biting into her neck. It was heavy, crude, and deliberately uncomfortable, a constant reminder that the restraint was not temporary. Every movement scraped metal against skin. Every breath made the collar shift, pulling her attention back to it. Around her, the other women were silent, not because they felt calm, but because they had learned what noise invited. The silence was enforced, learned, and maintained by fear. Outside the broken doorway, the sounds of the Northmen carried clearly. Guttural voices rose and fell as plunder was divided. Laughter cut through the air at irregular intervals, sharp and unrestrained. Somewhere nearby, chanting began, low and rhythmic, the kind Ealafu had learned to recognize over the past 9 days. The chanting accompanied rituals. The rituals accompanied selection, and selection determined who would be sold, who would be kept, and who would not survive the night. She shifted slightly, and the chain pulled tight. The woman beside her flinched in response, eyes wide, lips pressed together to keep from making a sound. This was how movement worked now. Individual will had been replaced by collective restraint. The design was intentional. The sources that later described this period would note how Viking captors linked prisoners together not only to prevent escape, but to force shared responsibility for suffering. One person's panic became everyone's pain. Through the doorway, Eilifu saw them, the berserkers. They were not like the other raiders. Ordinary warriors were brutal enough, operating with an efficient cruelty that served understandable purposes. They killed resistance, they took valuables, they restrained captives. The berserkers moved differently. They wore the skins of wolves and bears over their armor. Their faces were streaked with old blood not cleaned away after battle. They bit the rims of their shields and howled before fighting, and when wounded, they did not react as men should. Even now, days after the battle, something about them remained uncontained, as if the violence had not fully left their bodies. The woman next to Eilifu whispered a single word without sound, shaping it with her lips alone. Berserkai. Fear moved through the line like a tremor. One of them stepped away from the group and began walking toward the church. He was tall, broad, and marked by scars that crossed his arms and chest in irregular patterns. His hair was dark with streaks of red that had nothing to do with dye. His name, Eilifu would later learn, was Sigurd the Red, called that not for his hair but for his habits. He had killed 14 men in the taking of York. He had been among the first over the walls. For that service, he had been promised first selection from the noble captives. The silence inside the church deepened as he approached. 43 women pressed back against stone and wood, chains tightening, breath held. This was not panic. Panic had burned itself out days ago. This was recognition. The captives understood that what was about to happen followed rules. Brutal rules, but rules nonetheless. The Viking raids were not chaos. That was the lie later generations preferred. What followed a successful assault was structured, repeatable, and recorded. The first stage was capture, the second was sorting, the third was claiming, and it was at this stage that men like Sigurd exercised privileges denied to ordinary warriors. Berserkers occupied a unique position within Norse military culture. The sagas describe them as shock troops, men who fought in altered states of consciousness, who broke enemy lines through terror as much as force. When the fighting ended, they were not expected to return immediately to ordinary behavior. They were given outlets, access, rewards. Sigurd stepped into the church. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone changed the space. He walked slowly along the line of chained women, studying collars, clothing, posture. He paused in front of Eilifu. She did not raise her eyes. She had learned that looking directly invited attention she could not survive. But she could feel his assessment all the same. Her fine wool dress, torn and stained but still marked by expensive dye. The gold rings she had not yet been stripped of. The way she held herself, straight-backed even now, a posture learned over decades of authority. Nobility did not protect women in Viking raids. It increased their value. Sigurd reached out and lifted her chin with 2 fingers, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were calm, not enraged, not ecstatic. Calm. That frightened her more than fury would have. Fury passed. Calm made decisions. He nodded once, a signal to no one in particular. Behind him, another warrior stepped forward carrying a different collar, heavier, marked with carved runes. Ownership marks. The sources describe this moment in careful language, noting that high-value captives were often remarked to indicate personal claim. This was done publicly. The humiliation was part of the process. The old collar was removed. The new one was locked into place, colder, tighter, bearing Sigurd's mark against her throat. Eilifu did not resist. She had seen what happened to women who resisted marking. She stood still as iron replaced iron, as the chain was shortened, as the meaning of her existence shifted again. Around her, the other captives understood. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something else. Sigurd turned away, the chain in his hand. Eilifu rose because the chain required it. The line shifted as her movement pulled the others forward,
gasps and stifled sounds rippling through the group. The silence that followed the screaming was about to break. And what followed next was not recorded as a single event, but as a pattern, one repeated across 2 centuries of Viking raids, written into chronicles, hinted at in sagas, and later softened by those who preferred legends to truth.
The chain tightened the moment Sigurd stepped outside the church, and Eilifu stumbled forward because the iron allowed no alternative. The movement dragged the line behind her, bodies shifting, breath breaking, collars scraping against skin. This was deliberate. The removal of a claimed captive was never quiet. The sources describe it as instructional. Everyone left behind was meant to understand exactly what selection meant. The streets of York were barely recognizable now. What had once been ordered rows of homes and workshops had collapsed into a landscape of ash and broken stone. Smoke still rose from places where fires had been allowed to burn themselves out. Here and there, bodies lay where they had fallen, already stripped of clothing, jewelry, anything that could be carried. Dogs moved through the ruins without fear. Ravens had gathered on the walls. The city had entered the stage that followed conquest, when killing slowed and processing began. Sigurd walked ahead without looking back. He held the chain loosely, not because he trusted Eilifu, but because he did not need to tighten it yet. She followed because she had learned what resistance cost. Around them, Northmen moved with purpose, carrying plunder toward the river, sorting weapons, repairing armor. No one paid her any attention. Claimed captives became invisible to everyone except their owner. This, too, was intentional. It erased the idea of appeal. The building Sigurd brought her to had once belonged to a merchant whose wealth had made him a target. Its stone walls still stood, though the roof was partially collapsed. Inside, the space had been cleared and repurposed. A fire burned in the center of the room. Weapons hung from pegs along the walls. Animal pelts covered the floor, darkened by old stains that no one had bothered to clean. The air smelled of smoke, iron, and something musky and animal, a scent Eilifu would later associate with berserkers alone. 2 other women were already there, chained to iron rings set into the wall. They did not look up when Eilifu was brought inside. One sat with her knees drawn to her chest, rocking slightly. The other stared to nothing, eyes unfocused, mouth slack, as if speech had become unnecessary. Eilifu understood immediately that they had already passed through something she had not yet experienced. Sigurd closed the door behind them. The sound echoed in the small space, final and enclosing. He spoke then, but not to her. He spoke to another warrior who stood near the fire, gesturing briefly toward Eilifu before turning away. The exchange was short, efficient. Whatever decision was being communicated did not require discussion. What followed was not chaos. That is what later storytellers preferred to believe. Chaos excused cruelty by stripping it of intention. But the sources are consistent in their descriptions. What happened next followed established forms. The marking of property was more than a collar. It was a process designed to make ownership visible, undeniable, and psychologically complete. Sigurd removed the remaining signs of Eilifu's former life with practiced efficiency. Her jewelry was taken and placed aside without ceremony. Her fine wool dress, already torn, was replaced with rough fabric marked by a simple symbol that identified her as Saxon, a category rather than a name. Her hair, once carefully maintained, was cut short. Not shaved, not styled, simply cut away. The purpose was not humiliation alone, it was erasure. The sagas use a word that later translators softened. The word meant breaking. Not injury, not punishment, but transformation through force. To break something was to make it serve a new function by destroying the old one. Eilifu did not scream. She had learned from watching others that screaming did not change outcomes, it merely prolonged attention. She stood where she was placed, she followed instructions when they were given. She did not meet Sigurd's eyes unless forced.
Each act of compliance reduced the intensity of what followed by a margin so small it was almost theoretical, but margins were all she had left. The women chained to the wall watched her with a mixture of recognition and distance. One flinched when Sigurd moved too quickly, the other did not react at all. The sources describe this divergence clearly. Some captives remained alert, tracking every sound, every shift in posture, calculating danger. Others retreated inward, conserving what remained of themselves by disengaging from the world. Neither response was judged by the captors. Both were acceptable. What mattered was obedience.
When the initial marking was complete, Sigurd stepped back and assessed his work. This assessment was not aesthetic, it was functional. He checked the collar, the chain length, the placement of restraints. He adjusted one ring set into the wall, shortening the reach available to the three women. This was not to increase suffering, it was to establish limits early. Boundaries taught faster than pain alone. Only after this did he turn his attention fully to Eilifu. He spoke her name once, slowly, as if tasting it. Then he shook his head and spoke a different word in Old Norse, a category, the Saxon. The sources are explicit about this stage. Captives were stripped of their names and given labels that reflected ownership, origin, or function. Names tied people to families, histories, obligations. Labels tied them to markets. Night fell while the fire burned low. Outside, chanting rose again, distant but rhythmic. The rituals continued elsewhere in the camp. Eilifu did not know what they were, only that they marked time differently now. Days and nights had lost their meaning. What mattered was sequence. The first lesson of ownership was taught without explanation. Sigurd demonstrated that he could inflict suffering at will and stop it just as easily. The purpose was not indulgence, it was instruction. The sources describe this stage as necessary preparation. A captive who believed suffering was random might still resist. A captive who learned it was controlled by another's will learned predictability. Predictability led to compliance. By the time the fire burned down to embers, Eilifu had learned that resistance did not change outcomes, only intensity. Compliance reduced suffering, but did not stop it. There was no path that led away from what was happening. There were only paths that led through it, with more or less damage. When morning came, pale light filtered through the broken roof. Sigurd was gone. Another warrior brought food and water, placing them just within reach, then stepping back to watch. This too was part of the process. Dependence had to be established early. Eilifu ate because hunger weakened thought. She drank because thirst made pain sharper. The two women beside her ate mechanically, eyes fixed on nothing. Outside, York continued to be dismantled. Plunder moved toward ships. Captives were sorted again, redistributed, prepared for transport. Markets were already being planned in Scandinavia, in Dublin, along the rivers that connected the Viking world. What happened in this room was not separate from that economy, it was preparation. By the end of the second day, Eilifu understood the rule that governed everything now. Her body, her movement, her time, her identity were no longer her own. They were assets under management, and the management followed principles refined over generations of raiding. What she did not yet understand was that this marking was only the opening stage. The sources make clear that breaking was progressive. What she had experienced so far was introduction. The next stage was designed to ensure that what had been marked would never try to become whole again. The sources do not describe what followed as chaos, cruelty, or indulgence. They describe it as procedure. The word appears again and again in different forms, across Christian chronicles and Norse accounts alike, suggesting that what happened to claimed captives followed a recognized sequence. Not every detail is recorded. Medieval writers avoided explicit description, but the pattern is clear enough to reconstruct, and it begins with a simple principle. Obedience is not requested, it is engineered. For Ailifu, the third day marked the transition from marking to breaking. The distinction mattered. Marking changed how others saw her. Breaking changed how she saw herself. Sigurd returned after sunrise, his presence announced not by sound but by the way the air in the room seemed to tighten. He did not speak. Speech was unnecessary now. The rules had already been demonstrated. What remained was repetition. The first stage of the breaking protocol targeted the body, not for punishment but for instruction. The sources describe this stage using terms that later translators softened into phrases like establishing control. What control meant in practice was unmistakable. Ailifu was moved, restrained, released, and restrained again, always under observation, always in ways that made clear that every action depended on Sigurd's decision. Nothing was left to chance. Pain was applied precisely and withdrawn deliberately. The lesson was not that suffering existed. The lesson was that suffering could be turned on and off by someone else. This distinction mattered. Random violence produced terror, but terror burned itself out. Controlled violence produced predictability, and predictability reshaped behavior. By the end of the first week, Ailifu no longer reacted to pain itself. She reacted to signals. A shift in posture, a change in breathing, the sound of Sigurd's steps on stone. Her attention narrowed, focused entirely on anticipating what would minimize the next consequence. The sources describe this narrowing as success. The two women chained beside her illustrated different outcomes. The one who had arrived before her, the merchant's wife, remained alert, watching constantly, adjusting her behavior with visible calculation. The other, the craftsman's daughter, drifted further inward each day, her responses slowing, her eyes unfocused. Both were considered acceptable results. The protocol did not require awareness, it required compliance. Once physical dominance had been established, the second stage began. This stage targeted identity. Ailifu was forbidden to use her name. When she spoke it once without thinking, the response was immediate and instructive. Names connected captives to memory, to family, to the idea of continuity. The protocol required severing those connections. She was referred to only by a Norse term meaning Saxon woman, a label that reduced her to origin and function. Her former routines were erased. Prayer was forbidden. The gestures of her old faith, already mocked by the destruction of the church, were treated as defiance if attempted. The sources note that religious captives were often targeted this way, not because captors cared about belief, but because belief provided resistance. Breaking belief weakened the structure that held the self together.
Time itself was distorted. Days were no longer measured by light and darkness, but by events. Food appeared unpredictably. Sleep was interrupted and resumed at irregular intervals. The effect was cumulative. Disorientation made memory unreliable. Without memory, comparison became impossible. Without comparison, the present became absolute. By the second week, Ailifu understood that the protocol was not designed to destroy her physically. A dead captive had limited value. The protocol was designed to destroy her capacity to imagine alternatives. Every lesson reinforced the same conclusion. Resistance did not alter outcomes, it only altered intensity. Compliance did not stop what was happening, but it made it survivable. Survival became the only meaningful goal. The sagas describe this moment obliquely. They speak of captives who learned their place. The phrase appears neutral, even benign, until read alongside Christian accounts that describe the same process as breaking the will. Both sides are describing the same transformation from different perspectives. One calls it order, the other calls it desecration. Sigurd's role in this process was not personal. That was another misunderstanding later generations preferred. He did not act out of uncontrolled rage. He followed expectations associated with his status as a berserker. Berserkers were believed to carry battle fury beyond the field. The period after combat was considered dangerous both for them and for others. Granting access to captives was framed as management, a way to discharge what remained of the altered state. The result was a sanctioned space where ordinary rules did not apply. This sanction mattered. It meant there were witnesses. Other warriors knew what happened. Commanders permitted it. No one intervened. Silence was complicity, and complicity was universal. As the days passed, Eilifu's internal world contracted. Thoughts about her former life surfaced less frequently. When they did, they arrived without detail, like images seen through smoke. Her children's faces blurred. Her husband's voice lost clarity. This frightened her more than anything else. She understood, dimly, that memory was eroding, and that the erosion was part of the design.
The protocol adapted to response. When she complied quickly, intensity decreased. When she hesitated, it increased. This feedback loop trained behavior faster than force alone ever could. By the end of the third week, Eilifu moved when signaled, stopped when signaled, spoke only when addressed. The chain no longer needed to be pulled often. Anticipation replaced restraint. Outside, the great heathen army prepared to move. York had served its purpose. Plunder was loaded. Ships were readied. Captives were counted and recounted, evaluated for transport. Those deemed unsuitable were separated and removed. Eilifu did not see them again. The sources emphasize that not all captives survived this stage. Some broke too quickly, their bodies failing under stress. Others resisted too long, becoming examples. The protocol allowed for both outcomes. What mattered was that the system functioned. By the time Sigurd informed another warrior that his captive was ready, Eilifu understood what that word meant. Ready did not mean healed. It did not mean safe. It meant transformed. It meant she could now be moved, displayed, tested, and ultimately sold or retained without constant force. She did not know what her final disposition would be. She only knew that whatever came next would build on what had already been done. The breaking protocol did not end here. It prepared captives for the next mechanism in the system, one driven not by fury, but by profit. The breaking did not end because Eilifu had changed. It ended because the system required the next phase. The sources are explicit on this point. Once a captive was compliant, predictable, and stripped of self-directed will, continued violence was inefficient. What followed was not mercy. It was processing. York was no longer a city. It was a sorting site.
In the days after Sigurd declared Eilifu ready, she was removed from the stone house and taken into the open camp. This transition was itself a test. The chain remained, but it was loosened. The collar stayed. What changed was exposure. The camp was full of men who were not her owner, men who could see her, assess her, comment on her value without consequence. The purpose was deliberate. The sources described this stage as acclimatization. A captive who could not function under observation had limited market value. She was no longer treated as a singular object of domination. She had become a unit within a larger mechanism. That mechanism was the thrall system. Modern retellings often describe Viking slavery as opportunistic, an accidental byproduct of raiding. The documents say otherwise. The thrall system was organized, standardized, and economically central. Captives were not merely taken, they were evaluated, conditioned, and distributed according to demand. The violence that preceded this stage was not separate from the market, it was preparation for it. Eilifu was assessed again. Age, physical condition, signs of compliance, evidence of usefulness beyond endurance. Her bearing still marked her as noble, even after weeks of erosion. That mattered. Noble captives carried prestige. They could be resold at higher prices. They could be used as status symbols within elite households. They could be leveraged in negotiations. Her suffering had increased her value, not reduced it.
The camp itself was arranged to support this system. Captives were grouped by category, not by origin or prior status. Those marked as high value were kept separate, guarded, and fed just enough to maintain function. Those marked as expendable were worked harder, watched less, and disappeared more frequently. No explanation was offered. Explanation was unnecessary. Elifu learned new rules quickly. She learned where she was permitted to stand, when she was permitted to sit, how to lower her eyes without appearing defiant, how to respond to commands from men who were not Sigurd without assuming authority she did not possess. Every interaction was a test. Every mistake carried consequences. The thrall machine required consistency. Buyers expected merchandise that behaved predictably. The sources describe this expectation with unsettling clarity. Captives who demonstrated calm obedience fetched higher prices. Captives who showed lingering identity, anger, or despair were marked as risks. Around her, other women moved through the same process. Some adapted quickly. They learned to anticipate commands, to perform usefulness convincingly, to erase their former selves efficiently. Others struggled. Those women did not remain in the system long. The chronicles note their disappearance without detail, using phrases like, "did not survive transport," or "were lost." Sigurd's role changed during this stage. He no longer needed to enforce dominance constantly. That work had already been done. Now his task was to maintain his investment. He ensured Elifu was fed. He ensured she was not damaged unnecessarily by others, not out of concern, but out of calculation. Damaged goods were worth less.
This distinction mattered. It revealed the underlying logic of the system. Violence was not random. It was applied when it served purpose and withdrawn when it did not. Fear was the currency. Control was the product. The sources from both sides describe this moment differently but consistently. Christian chroniclers emphasized humiliation, writing of women paraded like livestock, measured and discussed openly. Scandinavian sources described allocation, speaking of captives assigned, managed, and prepared. Neither disputed the reality, only the framing differed. As the great heathen army prepared to move south, captives were reorganized again. Chains were rearranged, groups were reassigned to different ships. Elifu was placed among other high-status women, those whose collars bore individual marks rather than generic ones. This grouping was not accidental. High-value captives were transported together, protected from damage that might reduce resale potential. On the riverbank, ships waited. Long, narrow vessels built for speed and capacity. Plunder was already loaded, weapons stacked, food stores secured. The captives were brought last. This was another test. Elifu stepped onto the ship when directed. She did not look back at York. The city had already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. She focused on the chain, the wood beneath her feet, the commands shouted in a language she now understood just well enough to obey. The river smelled of smoke and rot. The water reflected a sky that felt indifferent. The thrall machine extended beyond the raid site. It connected rivers to markets, markets to households, households to further raids. It was a network that required captives like Elifu to function smoothly. Her role within it was now defined. She was no longer being broken. She was being transported. The sources note that this was often the moment captives realized the truth too late. What had happened so far was not the worst part. It was the necessary beginning. What came next would determine whether she remained property, became currency, or ceased to exist altogether.
The thrall machine tolerated compliance. It depended on it. What it could not tolerate was uncertainty. Resistance introduced variables, and variables threatened efficiency. For that reason, resistance was never addressed privately. It was addressed publicly, transformed into instruction. Elifu understood this before she saw it happen. The ship had been moving for days, hugging the riverbanks, stopping only to take on supplies or to rejoin other vessels from the army. The captives were kept below deck when weather allowed, brought up only in controlled intervals. Darkness and confinement served the same purpose they always had. They narrowed attention, they shortened memory, they made obedience automatic. It was during one of these stops that the resistance occurred. The woman's name, Elifu would later learn, was Eadgith of Mercia. She was younger than Elifu, perhaps 20 years old, taken during a later assault inland. She had been marked as high value for the same reasons Elifu had: clothing, bearing, and the remnants of education that showed in how she spoke. Unlike Elifu, Eadgith had not learned to conserve herself. She still believed, however faintly, that refusal could change outcome. When the captives were brought onto the riverbank to be counted and rechained, Eadgith pulled away. It was not a dramatic escape. She did not run far. The chain limited her movement, and the guards reacted instantly. But the moment mattered. The attempt itself was the violation. The system responded the only way it could. She was not taken aside. She was not dealt with quietly. She was dragged into the open space between the ships, where warriors and captives alike could see. The sources describe this stage in careful language, noting that discipline was administered as warning. The warning was not verbal. Sigurd was present, so were other berserkers. Their role in these moments was not incidental. Berserkers were enforcers not only through violence, but through symbolism. What they did was meant to be remembered.
Eadgith was forced to kneel. The chain was tightened. Commands were given in a language she understood well enough to know what was required. She did not comply. That refusal sealed what followed. The punishment was structured. It escalated in stages. Each stage paused long enough for observers to understand the cause and effect relationship. This was not rage. This was demonstration. The sources do not record Eadgith's screams. They record the reaction of those who watched. They note how other captives lowered their eyes, how bodies went still, how breathing slowed. They note how no one moved. This collective stillness was the true objective. Fear spread faster than chains ever could. When it ended, Eadgith was alive. That mattered. Death would have limited instructional value. Survival ensured memory. She was returned to the line changed, not physically broken beyond use, but visibly altered. Her posture had collapsed. Her eyes no longer tracked movement. When the chain moved, she moved without delay or hesitation. The resistance had been removed from her in a way words never could. Elifu did not look away during the punishment. She forced herself to watch. This, too, was adaptation. Those who did not watch often filled the gaps with imagination. Imagination made fear less precise, more chaotic. Precision was safer. That night, below deck, the captives were silent. No one spoke of what had happened. Silence did not mean ignorance. It meant acceptance of the lesson. The chronicles are clear about the purpose of these examples. Resistance threatened the economic logic of the system. It risked escape, injury, delay. The response had to be severe enough to make repetition irrational. Once a resistance example had been made, attempts decreased sharply. The system worked. As days passed, Elifu noticed changes in herself that frightened her more than punishment ever had. She no longer felt the surge of emotion she might once have expected. No anger, no despair, only calculation. Where to stand, when to move, how to avoid attention. Her thoughts had become narrow and practical, stripped of anything that did not contribute to immediate survival. The sources describe this state with unsettling neutrality. They note captives who became quiet or settled. These words appear repeatedly, suggesting approval. A settled captive required less oversight. A quiet captive retained value longer.
Sigurd observed these changes without comment. His interest in Eilifu now was transactional. He checked restraints, he ensured she was fed, he corrected behavior when necessary. There was no need for excess. Excess belonged to earlier stages. As the ships moved closer to the coast, rumors spread among the captives. Markets, settlements, different outcomes. Some would be sold, some would remain with their captors, some would be transferred between households as gifts or political tokens. No one explained which fate awaited whom. Uncertainty was another tool. The thrall machine depended on this uncertainty. Hope and fear both encouraged compliance. A captive who believed survival might lead to tolerable conditions behaved better than one who believed nothing mattered. The system exploited that belief carefully. One morning, the ships changed course. The river widened. The air smelled different. Salt replaced smoke. Eilifu recognized the shift without understanding it fully. They were approaching the coast. This was another sorting point. Captives were brought on deck in small groups. Names were not used. Numbers and marks were. Warriors discussed destinations. Hands gestured. Decisions were made without reference to the people involved. Eilifu stood where she was placed, eyes lowered, breath steady. She did not draw attention. She did not resist. Aegith was brought forward as well. She stood when commanded. She knelt when commanded. She did not speak. The resistance example had achieved its purpose. Sigurd listened as another man spoke, gesturing toward the shoreline. Eilifu did not understand the words, but she understood the structure of the exchange: negotiation, allocation, transfer. When Sigurd turned back toward the captives, he did not look at Eilifu immediately. He studied the group as a whole, assessing. This pause stretched. It mattered. Finally, he reached out and took hold of one chain. It was not Eilifu's. He closed his hand around Aegith's restraint and pulled her forward. A different decision had been made. A different lesson was about to begin. Eilifu remained where she was, chain slack, heart beating with an emotion she could not fully name. Relief, perhaps, or dread deferred. The resistance example was over. The consequences were still unfolding. And Eilifu understood, with cold clarity, that survival did not mean safety. It only meant she would live long enough to discover which role the system had chosen for her next.
The final stage did not arrive with violence. That, more than anything else, marked it as the end. When the ships reached the coast, the captives were unloaded without ceremony. There were no chants, no demonstrations, no public instruction. Those had already served their purpose. What remained was administration. The sources become colder here, shifting from narrative to record, from human experience to transaction. Eilifu stood on unfamiliar ground, the air sharp with salt and wind. She no longer tried to orient herself. Direction had lost meaning. What mattered were commands, spacing, timing. She moved when signaled. She stopped when signaled. The collar remained. The chain changed hands. This transfer is described in the records as allocation. Sigurd did not speak to her. He did not need to. Whatever claim he had exercised over her body and time had already produced its return. He had received his reward, and now he converted part of it into silver, alliances, or obligation. The sources do not tell us which. They only tell us that the exchange occurred. Eilifu became an entry. The thrall markets operated with the same logic everywhere the Vikings established them: Dublin, Hedeby, Kaupang, Birka. The details varied, but the structure remained consistent. Captives were presented, their marks were inspected, their behavior was observed, their usefulness was assessed. Silence and obedience increased value, visible distress decreased it. Buyers did not ask what had been done to produce compliance. They did not need to. The condition of the captive answered the question. This is where Eilifu's name disappears. Up to this point, fragments of her experience can be reconstructed from patterns, from cross-referenced accounts, from consistency across sources.
After this point, there is nothing personal left to recover. No chronicler followed her. No saga preserved her voice. No monastic writer recorded her fate, because by this stage, she no longer represented a moral warning worth recording.
She was not unusual. The records continue, but they speak in aggregate. They count women taken. They note prices. They describe shipments. They mention households supplied. They do not describe individuals. Individuality was not relevant to the system's function. Some captives were sold quickly, transported inland, absorbed into households where they lived out shortened lives in labor and enforced usefulness. Some were retained by elites, displayed as proof of conquest and reach. Some were traded again, passing through multiple hands until their origins were no longer known even to themselves. The sources confirm all of these outcomes. They do not assign them to names. It is possible Eilifu lived for years after this moment. It is possible she died within months. It is possible she adapted enough to survive in conditions that rewarded obedience and punished memory. It is possible she did not. The sources do not tell us. This absence is not accidental. Medieval chroniclers were capable of recording suffering in detail when it served a purpose. They wrote extensively about raids, executions, desecration. They described destruction vividly when it could be used to mobilize resistance or frame enemies as monstrous. But the long aftermath of captivity did not serve those purposes. It was repetitive. It was systemic. It implicated everyone who benefited from the economy of raiding, including those who traded with Vikings, paid them tribute, or absorbed their markets into local systems. Silence protected continuity. The Scandinavian sources are equally revealing in their omissions. Sagas celebrate raids, feasts, voyages, and lineage. They mention captives as property, as wealth, as background detail. They do not linger on their inner lives. They do not describe their adjustment. They do not ask whether survival was preferable to death. Those questions were irrelevant within a culture that treated captivity as a normal outcome of defeat.
What remains when the narrative ends is scale. Eilifu was one woman in one city in 1 year. The patterns that shaped her fate operated for more than 2 centuries across the British Isles, Ireland, and continental Europe. Tens of thousands of women passed through the same stages: capture, sorting, claiming, breaking, processing, distribution. Their experiences varied in detail, but not in structure. This is why modern reconstructions feel uncomfortable. They resist heroism. They deny resolution. They end not with justice, but with absence. The Viking Age is often remembered for ships cutting through fog, for warriors standing at the edge of the known world, for exploration and settlement and legacy. Those things are real, but they were sustained by systems that required silence to function. Chains do not appear in heroic narratives, neither do markets. When the sources stop naming women like Eilifu, it is not because nothing happened next. It is because what happened next was too ordinary to record. And that is the most unsettling truth the evidence leaves us with. Not that this brutality existed, but that it worked, that it was organized, and that for generations it was simply how power operated. The screaming ended. The system continued.